In 2007, John Mayer was someone very different to who we know today. He was better known for his high-profile relationships and bizarre TV antics than he was for his guitar playing.
Dumbest thing I ever did in my life.
Today, things are very different. He's probably the most influential guitarist and one of the most insightful songwriters of his generation. So, what changed? They say things don't happen overnight, but for John Mayer, they kinda did. John Mayer's musical story began when he was 13. Like many kids of his generation, Marty McFly's over-elaborate guitar solo in Back to the Future was the spark that first lit the musical fire. By this time, the mid-80s, blues music and blues guitar were no longer front and center in the mainstream, instead being replaced by the domination of synthpop. But not for a young John Mayer. A family friend introduced him to Stevie Ray Vaughan, who continued to break ground with blues guitar in the 80s. Stevie's life was tragically cut short when he died at just 35, but he'd already established himself as one of the greatest blues guitarists of all time. His distinctive tone, technique and stage presence we can see present in much of John Mayer's later performing. From the past there was Jimi Hendrix, Eric Clapton, B.B. King, great blues guitar players who inspired John to go through the hours and hours of practice to get to the high level of technique this music demands. But it was Stevie Ray Vaughan who was really the main influence. The first proper guitar he bought was a Stevie Ray Vaughan Fender Strat. He got a tattoo of Stevie's initials, and until recently, his guitar technician was the same guy Stevie used. It's fair to say that John was really obsessed not only with Stevie, but with blues guitar. He joined a high school band, Villanova Junction, where he not only played guitar, but we also hear his first attempts at singing.
Under violent skies we lay, wait for the storm to pass.
His voice obviously took some time to develop. I think he's probably a bit too influenced by Eddie Vedder here. But his playing is outstanding. John Mayer really could and can play guitar. I still think his playing is underrated today. When it came time to go to college, John moved from his home state of Connecticut in 1997 to study at Berklee College of Music in Boston, one of the best music schools in the world, especially for jazz and blues guitar. Berklee should have been where he found himself, where he met like-minded musically obsessed friends and found a place to belong. But what he found was something very different.
I went for 2 semesters in fall of 97 and the spring of 98, and they were 2 very different semesters. The first semester, I wanted to be a guitar player. I wanted to be the best guitar player I could possibly be.
He soon discovered he was chasing this unattainable goal that actually made it difficult to connect with people.
And I went home for the Christmas break and questioned everything. I looked back at everything. I went, do I want to be a guitar? Why is that not clicking in? And I just went back to the pop side of things. I went back to songs. And I went, well, this is what I want to do. I want to be listenable.
John at this point wasn't really a songwriter. He'd written a few songs with his high school band, but he wasn't a songwriter in the way we might think of, not compared to the years of dedication he'd spent practicing guitar. And so, he was presented with this fork in the road. Continue at Berklee, obsessing over guitar, something that had been his entire life up until now, but was now seemingly a creative dead end, or to put that to one side, leave Berklee, and try to make it as a singer-songwriter. Thankfully for John, the decision was made a little easier by having made a close friend at Berklee who felt the same way. Clay Cook was also keen to leave Berklee behind to go out and try and make things work as songwriters. Clay was from Atlanta, it had a healthy music scene and he knew the local spots and a few faces. So after just 2 semesters at Berklee, they both dropped out and moved down to Georgia. They formed a duo called Lo-Fi Masters, co-writing songs and playing gigs around Atlanta. And for John, the duo was kind of this halfway house between songwriting and blues guitar. But Clay had ambitions to turn it more into a band. John felt differently and clearly had his mind set on being a singer-songwriter, and so they split up.
I probably wasn't extremely collaborative. I don't think I was a strong group worker.
Now on his own, John released his debut independent EP in 1999, Inside Once Out. It features many of his early songs in a very stripped-down acoustic style, and yet despite abandoning much of his youthful blues influence, the songs aren't basic, they're complex and interesting. He built up a following around Atlanta, sold copies at shows, and demonstrated that he could sing, play guitar, and write his own songs. The following year, he got a record deal with Aware Records, and so everything was in place for John to record his debut album and prove himself as someone who could combine musical talent with accessible pop songs that would connect with people and make him listenable. This debut album, Room for Squares, is great. My favourite songs are the more interesting, less commercial ones, but they weren't the ones that connected with a wider audience. In fact, his career didn't launch because of his guitar playing or his interesting songs. It was something else.
Your body is a wonderland.
Your body is a wonderland.
Your body is a wonderland is my song.
Your Body is a Wonderland was probably the one song that wasn't musically interesting. It was this cheesy pop song, but hey, it launched his career, and although his more interesting songs and guitar playing went largely under the radar, it at least gave him recognition as a musician.
Listen, Johnny, there's no reason to be upset. You got a hit, baby. What more do you want?
I want to be a real musician.
You are a real musician. Hold on, I gotta put you on hold.
In an attempt to rescue his identity, 2 years later he released his second album, Heavier Things. This was a clear attempt to move away from the sensitive singer-songwriter style he'd been pigeonholed in, and embrace more of the blues music that he loved. There's a lot more electric guitar on this album, and some more interesting songs and production techniques. Bigger Than My Body was the first single, followed by Clarity. Two really good songs that demonstrated this new style, but they weren't a great success. They certainly didn't come close to the success of Your Body is a Wonderland.
And I was disheartened. And then they said, what about Daughters? Can you put Daughters out?
It was as if they said, hey, remember that song, Your Body is a Wonderland, the song you didn't like but was a hit? Well, there's one on here that's just like that. We know you don't want that as a hit either, but hey, what about that?
They really want this to go. I think it can be a hit. And I was like, I don't want it to be a hit. I would rather not have a hit with this song, because this song is going to peg me forever as sensitive songwriter God.
The label got their way and released Daughters. Now, Daughters really is a beautiful song. I really do like it. But much to John's disappointment in a way, the song was a massive success. Far more successful than the singles John had chosen. It even won Song of the Year at the Grammys. All his efforts to show himself as a thoughtful songwriter weren't working. His lifetime of guitar mastery was going completely under the radar. And the more he tried, the more it backfired and dug him further and further into this hole as the sensitive songwriter guy. To satisfy his own growing hunger for blues music, he formed the John Mayer Trio in 2005 with Steve Jordan and Pino Palladino. Like his hero, Stevie Ray Vaughan, John was now front and centre playing blues, and whilst it was never meant to be as successful as his pop career, it did at least give him a chance to play music that he really loved.
Trio for me was such the inverse of the pop thing, which is, that was all guitar. Basically, the trio slammed the needle all the way to the right, and on the guitar side of the spectrum.
I guess it could work to have these two extreme identities. He could have his main career with the cheesy pop stuff, and then have the blues trio at the other end of the spectrum. Well, not exactly. When it came time for his third album, Continuum, John doubled down on what he did before, evolving his style even more and incorporating more of this blues influence and guitar playing. He got rid of the acoustic pop hits and brought in Steve Jordan and Pino Palladino from the trio into a much larger role that gave it this blues influence. Steve Jordan actually co-produced the album with John. Maybe this was it. Maybe if he fully embraced the blues into his pop career, this was going to clearly show John's true identity, and he didn't need these two extremes with the pop hits and the blues trio.
I had just finished making Continuum, and handed it in, and my manager played it for the head of the label. And I was, what'd he say? What'd he say? What'd he say? And the call, I remember where I was. The call came in and he said, he doesn't hear anything on it. He doesn't hear a hit. Wants you to go back and write some more stuff.
John said it was the only time he cried after making an album and seriously thought about quitting music. And I can see his point. He's made something that he really felt was great, and then he was told, we don't want this. Anyway, the album went out and they were both sort of right. There were some singles, but no hits at the level of Your Body is a Wonderland or Daughters. But as an album, it performed really well. It was considered by many to be his best album yet, and in fact it's probably still considered by many fans his greatest album today. So now he had this problem. He had these three distinct musical personalities, that were not only incompatible but were also at odds with each other. He had the acoustic songs, which did well commercially, but he didn't really want as hits. He had this new album, which was great, but didn't have any hits. And then he had the blues trio that he loved, but didn't have any mainstream commercial value. In the fall of 2006, John began touring in support of the Continuum album. The basic premise was to tour as usual with a full band, but with small moments of experimentation within each show. He might do a few acoustic songs on his own, and he'd also experiment with older songs and deeper cuts. Slowly, through finding out what the audience liked and what worked musically, he could start to evolve the live show into something that would bring together these different musical identities, and also the different fractures of his audience that went with them. Gravity grew from a song thrown in the middle of a setlist into a signature closing song. Slow Dancing in a Burning Room, which was never released as a single, became a fan favourite. And throughout the tour, he'd experiment with a range of different cover songs.
This is a cover song. It's one of my and our favorite George Harrison tunes.
Slowly, over months of touring, the show began to turn from this random mismatch of songs into one coherent show, with a single personality and musical thread running through beginning to end. Well, this worked fine for the shows, but the people coming to shows were John Mayer fans already. So how could he communicate this to a wider audience to establish this new developed personality? And logistically, Steve Jordan and Pino Palladino weren't even on tour for the trio, so he couldn't expect them to tour around the world for years on end just for a few songs during their set. The tour came to an end in late 2007, but there was one final show taking place that December, a one-off charity show taking place in LA. The idea was to use this one-off event to bring everything together, both logistically and artistically. Everything he'd learned from the previous year touring meant he could now present this single musical identity within one evening, and use this one-off event to bring the trio together as well. The show began with an acoustic set, 5 songs with a perfect blend of virtuosity, blues and songwriting. A cover of Tom Petty's Free Falling would become a fan favourite, and throughout the tour different covers made the setlist, but this was the one that worked well enough to make it to the final evening. After the acoustic set was an 8-song set with a trio, featuring a mixture of both original songs and blues covers, highlighting probably John's best guitar work up until this point. And finally was the full band, playing this finely tuned set of mostly album tracks which had evolved over the previous year. The whole evening was this accumulation of everything that was great about his music. It's his songwriting at its best, it's his guitar playing at its best. The whole show is this single thread of a musical identity. Despite the contrast in styles, not a single song feels out of place. The show was released as both a live album and a concert film, and it came out at the perfect time. YouTube was still in its infancy, and so people began uploading covers of his songs as a way to showcase their own guitar playing ability. This concert and the recordings of it are now 17, 18 years old, and we can now see a whole generation of guitarists who are inspired by this, including me. I remember watching these bootleg videos posted on YouTube in the late 2000s and being inspired to play this kind of guitar, and also being introduced to more blues music. Despite releasing lots of new music since this time, John hasn't released any more live albums. A live album of the solo tour would be great. I've seen him a few times, but the solo tour was really special. But what's so great about Where the Light Is that unlike many albums which are just the usual songs which happen to be played live instead of in the studio, this album is a guidebook. I think what John gave us with this album was the way he felt when he first discovered Stevie Ray Vaughan. It's like a portal that shows us how this should be done. I don't think there is any live album from the past 25 years that has had nearly the same influence on blues guitar than Where the Light Is. This one evening took John Mayer from that sensitive songwriter into probably the most influential guitarist of his generation.
I feel like the night was really authentic. I feel like my music is a lot more necessary. I was told that at the end of it, everybody got the sense that it was like 3 distinct bands, which is what I always wanted anyway, so it's good to know that that's actually the case, you know? And it's a great place to be now to make another record, to become so familiar right now with what I've done so that I can figure out what I haven't done and then just make that, you know?